Shadric Sutton. Shadric is a junior honor student studying criminal justice with concentration on forensic science. He aspires to be an investigator. At 18, he enlisted in the U.S. Army and later was honorably discharged. Shadric is the father of 5 children he loves dearly, and for whom he enjoys cooking. He also has a passion for running. Describing to you a case study and report for a recovering addict. Please welcome today's presentation, Shadric Sutton.
As mentioned, I'll be presenting a case study and report of a recovering addict. The experiences today will begin with our subject's active addiction. It'll move on to some of the steps he has taken in recovery, and it will end with where he stands today. At the peak of his active addiction, he believed that he would never be anything more than an addict and a drug dealer. He resided in an apartment in a small town, and he had a buyer over, someone that was looking to purchase product that he had. They were both getting high, and the buyer decided that he did want to purchase. The buyer leaves. The subject leaves a little later to go be with friends and to go do what a drug dealer does. Later that evening, he receives a phone call. It's the buyer. The buyer is not happy with the product. This makes our subject irate. I find it important to note that at this point, the subject had been awake for anywhere between 4 to 6 days. So his mental faculties were very short-fused. He becomes very angry, starts shouting obscenities, and tells the buyer that if he wants more drugs or money, he would have to pry it out of his cold, dead hands. Later that night, much later that night, he returns home. He has a friend with him. They go into the apartment. He and the friend decide that it's time to get some sleep and that they would wake up the next day and start their routine and process all over again. With the events of the day, he decides that he will sleep in the living room, affording his friend to have the bedroom. Just as he's getting ready to lay down, there's a knock on the door. This is absolutely astonishing to the subject because no one comes over unannounced to his apartment, just simply because of the unsavoriness that he was partaking in. He begins searching in his pitch black living room, feeling around. There's another knock on the door and a voice. He realizes it's the voice of the buyer. The buyer's shouting, demanding entry, saying that he's going to mess up the subject's vehicle and that he's going to make sure that the whole neighborhood knows what he's into. He finds what he's searching for. He finds his handgun. He puts the magazine in the mag chamber, cocks the slide, placing a round in the chamber, drops the mag, puts one more bullet in, replaces the mag into the handgun, places the handgun at the small of his back in his waistband, and he just waits. Boom, boom, boom on his door. Now, the subject was having none of this disrespect. He was fed up. He rushes toward the door, unlocks it, opens the door, and begins to confront the buyer. The buyer very intimidatingly backs him up into his own living room of his apartment. The subject moves to the corner diagonal from the front door. Now, the subject knows that he keeps a baseball bat behind his front door. He also knows that would not be his weapon of choice in this instance. But the buyer doesn't know that. The buyer closes the door. The subject eyeballs the baseball bat, drawing the attention of the buyer to the baseball bat. The subject reaches in his waistband and prepares to draw the handgun. In that moment, the friend comes around the corner from the bedroom. The subject sees this friend out of the corner of his eye. And in a moment of fear or exhaustion or burnout, he releases his grip on the handgun. The buyer at that point comes toward the subject with the baseball bat, demanding the drugs and any and all money that he has on him. The subject gives it to him. The buyer leaves. Immediately, the subject starts to take his TV off the wall, going through the apartment, gathering the rest of his valuables, placing it around the TV, including both sets of keys to his 3-year-old vehicle. The buyer left that day with more than drugs and money. The buyer left that day with every sense of safety that the subject had. The subject felt that there was no safe place in the world for him, not even his home. After he gathers all the valuables and places it against the wall in his living room, and the adrenaline starts to leave his body, he finds himself in the center of his living room floor, curled in the fetal position, crying, bawling, sobbing, gasping for air, hyperventilating, with waves of panic rushing over him. Several days later, he decides to go tell his parents what had happened. In doing this, he would later realize that for the first time, he was telling someone else, besides another addict in active addiction, that he had a problem. Again, he didn't realize it at the time, but he felt some release from that. And he made the decision to tell his ex-wife and mother of his oldest 2 children the same. Told her what happened. But at this point, he still didn't believe that there was any other life for him. He still believed that all he was bound to be was an addict and a drug dealer. Little did he know, the mother of his oldest 2 children recorded the conversation. She presented that recording to the Department of Child Services. The Department of Child Services came, did an investigation, required him to take a drug test, and referred him for an assessment to a behavioral health care addiction service. Now, after her assessment, she had to leave. She had to go and interview the mother and the children. But she had to go right then before the drug testing company could come for his urinalysis. So in between, he's in his apartment alone. He starts going and he gets rid of all the paraphernalia. He gathers up all the baggies of drugs that he has, puts them in the toilet, flushes the toilet, and somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes later, the drug testing company shows up. It's a very nice lady and a very nice man. The lady's very short, the man very tall. 6 foot, I'd say 6'5" to 6'7" if I remember. So he's giving his urine sample, and the man had told him, I have to watch you give this sample so that we can be sure that it's pure. He completes giving the sample, hands the cup to the man, looks in the toilet, and there's still several baggies floating in the toilet. He just shakes his head and flushes the toilet. He thought for sure he was going to jail at that point. Turns out the drug testing company just leaves. The cops never showed up. So he goes for his assessment at the Behavioral Health Care Services. And they drug test him there again. On both accounts of the drug tests, he had been high and had methamphetamines in his system. He was referred by the counselor for inpatient rehabilitation services. He ends up going to the rehab. He's there for approximately 21 days. And during this 21 days, he's in class for 10 to 15 hours a day, learning about recovery and how it's possible, and his belief changed. He believed that he could lose the desire to use and live a life free from the use of drugs. But he also met a group of people, a fellowship, a 12-step program. It's a group of other recovering addicts that help each other navigate the path of recovery. He tries really hard. He doesn't have the desire to use anymore, but by listening to the experiences of these other recovering addicts, he doesn't focus on the recovery enough, and he's only hearing the using stories, and he goes back out and he relapses and relapses and relapses. And even after study and diving into the literature and connecting with the people and inevitably connecting with God, he still finds himself relapsing. There had to be another way. So he starts to do some research, and he finds out that 1% of people manage to have any length of recovery time without continued participation with a 12-step program. They tell him, the reports that he's read has told him that he can't do it. Someone very near and dear to him was doing it and told him, try it for 6 months. If it doesn't work, go back to the 12-step program. He gives it a shot. He continues to develop his relationship with his higher power that he chooses to call God. He studies spiritual principles, connectedness to people and to God, because connectedness is the opposite of addiction, not abstinence. I remember laying in the middle of my living room floor, curled up in the fetal position, crying, bawling, sobbing, gasping for air as waves of panic came over me. My name is Shadric Sutton. I'm a grateful recovering addict, and today I have 3 years and 24 days clean.